Graff Hog Farm who had retired and moved away. And it was such a blessing. I told them I'm teaching at the Alaska Bible College now, and they were like, "That was so awesome." And I got the opportunity to tell them that most of the things that I'm teaching the students at the Alaska Bible College, I learned from you all. And let me tell you, it was such a great blessing to be able to tell that to the people, to my professors. So
So what is your doctoral emphasis? What's it in? It's not an agriculture or horticulture. What is it?
it's actually it's in geospatial uh, science, and that's something called, well, GPS. You all know what that is, okay? And then there's another science called geographic information systems, and that's a special type of engineering that allows you to ask questions of maps. um, I got involved with it in the early 1990s. GPS was a brand new thing. I had just gone to work for Cornell University, and I got a letter from the National Science Foundation saying, "Would you be interested in getting involved in this new technology?" And I didn't know what it was, but I thought, well, if no one else is doing it, maybe it's something for me to get involved with. And to make a long story short, I got involved with it. It was computers were still relatively primitive. And those of y'all that have had me in class know that I like to joke a lot. And I thought it would be funny to automate a go kart so that it could drive itself. And it turns out that was a big deal. So we eventually it led into automating farm equipment and tractors. Okay, so tractors now, you sit in the cab, but you don't have to steer them. You don't have to run the throttle. They run themselves. They run all the equipment, and that's all because of geospatial technology. And that's what my PhD was in.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that. I just thought you were the farm guy.
Well, like I said, all my farming knowledge came from working on a pig farm, which, by the way, in 1979, a tornado blew through the Graff Hog Farm and blew 5,000 pigs all over Wilbarger County, Texas.
So pigs do fly.
They do. They do. Well, I lied and said that I could drive a three on the tree uh, uh, clutch
Yeah,
pickup truck,
right.
which I could not. But it was a very short learning curve because my job was to pick up dead pigs all over the county. There is nowhere but up from there. Okay. And it's a great way to learn how to drive a truck with a clutch, because if you pop the clutch wrong and 20 pigs dump off the back, you have to put them back on again. So I learned to drive a clutch truck very quickly.
Well, I know that in your work in science, as well as in your hobby, which I understand is mountaineering, uh, we have been talking about learning to love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and now we're talking about sincerity of faith. A faith that is real, is genuine, sincere, is open and honest, those kinds of synonyms. And so I think we'd like to hear from you about mountaineering particularly. How has God used that to, if you allow me to make up the word, to sincerifies your faith? Talk about a sincere faith in your experience in the wilderness.
Well, I anticipated that you would ask that. So I want to pull up a Bible passage which I think represents all of that for me. Of course, it takes forever to pull up, but it's Romans 1:20. Okay. And I and it says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." And what that means is, if you look around and you see Pioneer Peak and the mountains and all this, that's clear evidence that God created this, and that's evidence of his existence. And for me, mountaineering, when you're up on top of a mountain and you see all that splendor, well, I'll give you an example. On the Kahiltna Glacier on Denali is one of the most splendid sights you will ever see. And you look at that and you're like, oh my, this is the hand of God. And this is so incredible. How could you not look at this and not realize? I mean, I could understand that you could be agnostic and look at this and not necessarily believe in Jesus, but I don't know how anyone could not believe that there is a God that created this. And that's been my love for mountaineering. It started when I was 11 years old. I was a Boy Scout, and we went to the Quartz Mountains of Oklahoma, which are nothing compared to Alaska, but I fell in love with it. And ever since then, it's just I I went out in my barn. I have a room where I keep all of my mountaineering gear, and I was trying to find my climbing Bible. And I have it- Romans 120 dog-eared in that Bible, and I've read it on every mountain, every major mountain that I've ever climbed. And it's one of those things. Mountaineering, uh, to me, is one of those things that sort of enforces my faith because it reminds me, one, how insignificant I am, but on the other hand, how great God's love is for us, that He created this to enjoy. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And you put those two ideas together, the love of God for you and how your own insignificance, you put those things together. What do the mountains do to keep you honest? I mean, this is not a religious experience, it's a deeply spiritual one, correct?
That's correct. I mean, mountains keep me honest because they keep me humble. There is many times where I've turned back because the weather wasn't right. It was too unsafe. Well, no, I will tell you one time where my pride got in the way. Okay, one of my first big mountain climbs was Long's Peak in Colorado. It is one of the most difficult mountains in the Colorado Rockies. Okay, and I first tried to climb it when I was 18, and I got turned back by a thunderstorm, and I was really upset by that, but I was smart enough to turn back. The second time I went, I made it to the summit. The third time I went, I made it to the summit. The fourth time, I did one of the most difficult North Face rock climbs in North America, and I aced it. The fifth time, I did it without ropes, just because I wanted to try to do it. And I was still in my early 20s. Well, I went back when I was 40 and tried to do it without ropes and got stuck and had to be rescued. And it was so embarrassing, but I realized, it was one of those things where you have to be honest with yourself and recognize that when you need help, you need to ask for it. And I can remember there were these two college students that were climbing above me. I'm like, I need your help. And they rappelled down to me and rescued me. And I think that's kind of reflective of why we need to ask help of, of Jesus, because we get into situations that we can't handle, and there's only one rescuer that can help us. And so,
And I know even in my own experience in the wilderness, you get this sense that you take yourself so seriously until you're dwarfed by the realities of creation. What makes a wilderness wild is it's so unpredictable. Now for you, it sounds like the Long's Peak. Your motto was "Climb it till it kills me." Is
yeah.
that, Is that kind of your view?
That was kind of my view. And a similar thing happened on Denali. Fortunately, over the years, I'd gained wisdom. And the first year I was on Denali, I was up there for a month, and we had gotten our cache in at 16,000 feet. We came back down to 14,000 feet. At 14,000 feet, there's what's called the head wall, and it's a 2,000-foot sheer wall that you have to climb up. And the weather went bad, and we sat there for weeks waiting for the weather to clear. And it was very tempting to try to go ahead and make the climb. But fortunately, we were wise enough to just sit there. And what do you do for weeks at 14,000 feet with nothing else to do? Well, we had a Star Trek novel that we made plays, and we took turns playing different people in the Star Trek novel. And guess who my role was? This No, it was Lieutenant Uhura.
Oh, really?
And let me tell you, I was the best Lieutenant Uhura that there has ever been.
Well, so you go to a place like Denali, you're up on the mountains a month or 6 weeks, okay? And you come home. How does that experience on the mountain impact your daily life back at home? How does it impact your marriage? How does it impact your family? How does it impact your work?
Well, let me tell you, the first year I went up was 2009. The second year I went up was 2010, and I made the summit. The best thing you will ever see after an experience like that is your wife. It was like, you can hug someone, but then there is like hug.
Get a room hug.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I'm very fortunate in that my wife is very supportive of my climbing. And I'll back up beyond that. My undergraduate degree at Texas A&M University was recreation and parks. And that's what you major in if you want to be a mountain climber. Okay. Fortunately, let me just say, while I was a sophomore at Texas A&M, I met the future Mrs. Brown. And as things were transpiring, I realized that I could be married to her or I could be a mountain guide, but I couldn't be both because mountain guides don't make much money. They're always away. That wouldn't be fair to my wife. But I figured my long-term plans were much better with her than mountaineering. So we got married, and I decided not to become a mountaineer or not to become a mountain guide. But now I have a degree with something that I can't really do anything with. Okay. There's not many jobs that you can show people how to tie knots or place anchors that you're going to make any money. So I went back to school, and for my master's degree, I majored in environmental science with an emphasis in a special type of fungus that some of you all have heard me talk about. And then I eventually would go on to earn a PhD in this geospatial technology. What I didn't realize that God knew the desire of my heart was mountaineering. Okay. And when I was an undergraduate, I thought the way to that goal of my heart was to major in it and become a mountain guide. What I didn't realize was that by following God's desire for me, He was preparing me, okay, for a much better situation for mountaineering. So eventually, I gained all these different skills in engineering and geospatial technology that would eventually lead me to Alaska. And now I got to climb mountains on my own terms rather than doing it for someone else, which was a much, much better situation than I could have possibly asked for. And it eventually it put me in a job that would allow me to go climb mountains for science. Um, One of the things that I did, the third tallest mountain in North America is Orizaba in Mexico. It's 18,500 feet tall. It has a huge glacier system on it. And I was able to get a grant from the American Alpine Club to go map that glacier with ground penetrating radar and GPS. And that has since taken me all over the world. So I'll tell the dean at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, I need to go to, say, Aconcagua, the tallest mountain in the Western Hemisphere in Argentina, to map the glacier. And she's like, oh, please, what an excuse. You're using science, the excuse of science to go map this thing, but it's true. So,
Well, so we know about a few of the summits you've done. What are the others?
oh boy, I've been all over the world. One of them that I'm most proud of is Mount Elbrus in Russia. It's the tallest mountain in Europe. But the reason I'm so proud of it was in, let's see, 2012, the outhouse at the base camp of Mount Elbrus was voted the most nastiest outhouse of any base camp mountain in the world. And I have pictures.
Were you responsible for how nasty it was?
Well, I did contribute.
What about, the big famous mountains, K2, Everest?
Well, I was actually supposed to do Everest 2 years ago. And for the first time ever, my wife had a bad feeling about it. And she's never had a bad feeling about any mountain I've ever done before. So I said, I'm not going to do Everest. And I'm really glad for that. I found another mountain that's very similar to Everest called Stoke Kongri in the Himalayas of India. And we went and did it. And it turned out to be a much better experience than Mount Everest would have been because on Mount Everest, it's become a kind of a cliche. A lot of people climb Mount Everest. Well, normally Mount Everest would be the pinnacle of your climbing career. Okay. You've climbed many, many mountains, you've studied, you've worked, and then now you go do Everest. Well, the problem with Everest now is that many people it's their first mountain ever. And so ideally, if you're climbing that mountain, you have the same skill level as the guides that you're going with. So Nepal requires that you hire a mountain guide and Sherpas. Well, the thing is, if you're on Everest and you don't have those skills and you get into trouble, you're in real trouble. Whereas when we went to Stoke Kongri, there was only one other group on the mountain. And so it was great. You got to experience this in a sense by yourself. We rigged our own routes. We set our own anchors and things like that. Unfortunately, the other group that was on the mountain with us, it was a French expedition. They normally you give yourself a couple of days to make the summit. You get your high camp, okay, and then in case of bad weather or other situations, you'll put 3 or 4 days where you can hold back. Well, the French team decided they were going to go for it in bad weather, and we decided we were not. And we didn't know it, but they were lost somewhere on the mountain and almost certainly died in a fall, whereas we held back a day and made it to the summit. If we had known that they had been lost, we have certainly been part of the search party for them.
You tell the story how your wife had this bad feeling. I mean, so that speaks to sort of a confidence you have in her faith as well. I mean, talk to us about that discussion with your wife about that mountain. you wanted to go, she felt bad about it. You had to make a decision.
Well, those of y'all that have had me in class have probably heard me talk a lot about my wife. There is no better thing than to have a godly wife. Let me tell you, guys, hold out for a godly wife. I'm very fortunate that she was also very pretty. But I don't care if she looks like Medusa. A godly wife is the most valuable thing you could ever have. Um, as you all know, my wife is Jewish, and she grew up. Both of her parents experienced the Holocaust. Her father was in Dachau, and I just recently learned that he was in 3 other concentration camps in Nazi Germany. He was fortunate that the Dominican Republic was the only country in the world that would take Jewish refugees. He got out of Dachau just before the War of the Atlantic broke out. That was the submarine war. And he was one of only a few hundred people who made it to the Dominican Republic. But they created a Jewish agricultural colony there. And my wife was fortunate to go all the way through Jewish Hebrew school. And the reason I tell you that is one of the hardest people to reach for Jesus are Jewish people who had 2 Jewish, hardcore, nearly kosher parents, and to have gone all the way through Hebrew school. My wife speaks Hebrew. I was just joking that sometimes the pastor in our church will talk about some Hebrew things, and my wife will get upset because she has such a deep understanding of Hebrew law, Hebrew customs, and stuff like that, that she's like, that's not right. And I'm like, just come on, go easy. You know, the pastor's a rookie in this area, okay? So anyway, the reason I tell you that is people with that kind of background are very, very hard to reach with Jesus because they'll have a very deep Jewish faith. But she had a college roommate and a college professor witness to her, and it sparked an interest in her to read up on this. And she spent a year studying, and she finally decided that no, this is correct. And she came to faith not through the New Testament, but through the Old Testament. And I go there because she was a believer when we met, but she was a young believer. And you don't become a strong believer just one day to the next. She was evolving, and we got married, and she was afraid to tell her parents that she had become a believer because many Jewish parents, especially ones that are Holocaust survivors, if you say you've become a believer, they will have a funeral for you. And we were married for about 5 years before she worked up the courage to tell her folks.
So it was okay for her to marry a Christian, just not to be one.
You know, that's the funny thing. It was great for me to be a practicing Christian. That was great. They're like, we're proud of that. Just not her. So she finally worked up the courage to tell her folks, and they were extremely upset. Fortunately, they didn't disown her or have a funeral, but they did remove any inheritance that she had. They gave all of her inheritance to her sister.
So they believe she was eschewing her heritage, not just her faith. And they can't come to the place where they see Christ as the completion of that.
No, and she would explain to her parents, there is nothing that I do as a Jew that is not in accordance with being a Christian. So, the concept that Jesus was Jewish and he was a faithful Jew is something that they just can't get their hands around.
Yeah, if your pastor was wise, he'd see your wife as a resource.
Well, He, you have to understand Jewish culture too, okay? It's really tough being a Gentile from Texas who grew up in the Methodist church, married to a very faithful Jewish family. It There is no bigger difference in culture. So I'll give you an example. Um, the first Jewish Seder we had, okay, Passover, okay, it's traditional that you drink the glasses of wine. Well, I didn't notice that her father had taken the biggest wine glass we had and put it at my place at the table, and everybody else had tiny wine glasses. And they're telling me that I have to drink all of this wine. We're getting towards the end of the Seder, and I'm like,
I put 7 glasses, something like that, 7 or 8.
what they're doing is they're just taking a sip,
Oh, okay.
but they're having me drink it all, and I'm not noticing this. So they're playing all these kind of jokes on me because I just don't know. The other thing too is in this particular Jewish culture, you're supposed to always take seconds and thirds of food. Okay. Well, growing up the way I did, you took as much as you wanted in the beginning and you were done. Well, it's an insult to Jewish mothers if you don't take seconds. So I had filled up on all the food I wanted. And my wife is like, "Don't you like my mother's cooking?" And I'm like, "Well, I can't eat anymore." She's like, "You don't like my mother's cooking?" And here's an even better example. The best compliment you could give a Jewish wife is to say, "You know, honey, your meal is not as good as your mother's." That is a compliment. Okay. So if you come to my house, and hopefully when we get out of this COVID thing, I would love to invite you all to come to a Passover Seder at our house. Uh, you will hear me say, this gefilte fish is not as good as your mother's. It's like, thank you, thank you.
That's very funny.
So anyway, where that comes back to is I am so fortunate to have a wife of great faith. Uh, I'll tell you up front, her faith is much greater than mine. Uh, and I've always prayed that, please, God, don't test me in the ways that you've tested her.
So segue a little bit that, it seems to me that you kind of live in the midst of a couple of different cultures that would be strange to most evangelicals. Jewish family, also this scientific world, right? So would your father-in-law say that he believed after watching you, how many years have you been married?
33 years.
Okay, after 33 years, would your father-in-law and mother-in-law say that they believed your faith in Christ was sincere?
I think they would say that, even though my in-laws, um, they would say that.
And is there any particular story you can tell us where you think that showed up in your relationship with them, the sincerity of your faith?
I think it's one of those things where I don't know how to demonstrate it because they were in the Dominican Republic. Uh, they were. I can tell you they were very proud that from the onset, from the time we got married, we attended church and we searched for different churches. It's kind of odd to describe. They didn't want their daughter to be a Christian, but they were proud that their son-in-law was very devoted to his faith.
Well, go to the work world, the science world. Okay, what does demonstrating a sincere faith look like in a world where you're surrounded by those who are either agnostic or more atheistic?
Let me tell you, that's tough. I think, well, those of y'all that had me in class yesterday, we were talking about this, that supposedly in science, there's not supposed to be a bias, but there is tremendous bias and there's tremendous peer pressure to conform to everybody else. So there's certain things that you are supposed to believe in. For example, evolution. Okay. Uh, if you're a scientist and you say, I don't get evolution or I have problems with it, that is the kiss of death in science. Okay. To even question it, to say, why is there a gap here in this, in the history of the world, or why do, or one of the things that's gotten me in so much trouble is I'm like, well, if you look at the theory of evolution, something is pushing it. Okay. And it doesn't make sense because according to the laws of thermodynamics, systems get simpler, not more complicated. So anyway, it's been very difficult for me to deal with that. When I was a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, I was the founder of their doctoral program in geospatial engineering. I had published many original papers. When the space shuttle crashed in the early 2000s, I was asked by FEMA and NASA to lead the recovery effort, which I published many, many landmark papers on that. I was denied tenure. And I'm almost certain it was because I invited the dean of the Alaska or the Texas Bible College to come give a lecture on ethical origins of religions. And he gave this fantastic talk. And he basically was saying that most religions have certain tenets, like thou shalt love your mother and father, thou shalt not kill, things like that. But he eventually led the lecture to Jesus. The faculty went nuts over it, that I would invite someone to come and speak like that. And so it cost me my career at the University of Texas. Um,
But you get to be here.
well, see, that's the thing. That's the thing. I thought I was so proud of being this young PhD leading this one of the only doctoral programs in this field in the country. Uh, and I have to say, God humbled me. He didn't allow me to get tenure, so I had to leave the university. So it sent me I got a job at Kansas State University with the Cooperative Extension Service, and it was all preparing me for Alaska. So, the greatest desire of my heart was to be in Alaska and to be able to climb Alaska mountains. What I didn't realize is that God was preparing me for that. And here's the even cooler thing. My wife and I had always said, what are we going to do when we retire? I said, well, wouldn't it be cool to be a professor at a Bible college somewhere? Well, wouldn't you know it, I was heading off to a missions trip to Haiti, and oh God, I can't think of his name. He used to work here. He was no, it wasn't John Birch. Well, anyway, he was a staff member here at the Bible College, and this is when the Bible College was just beginning to make the move from Glen Allen to here. And he was asking me, what do you want to do when you retire? And I said, I'd love to be a professor at a Bible college somewhere. Well, that set into motion the opportunity to come here and teach. And the Bible college approached me and said, we need someone to teach science. What would you be interested in teaching? And I said, well, geospatial calculus would be. And I was serious. I mean, I was thinking what could be more fun than that particular topic? And I remember looking at me, it's like, you can't be, no. So they gave me the assignment, go think of something else. And I'm like, well, horticulture for missionaries would be something that students could really use. The only problem was I was like, God, if I was an undergraduate student and I had to take horticulture, what a boring subject that would be. And I have to give you all credit for being very uh, good students and making me think that you're enjoying it. So I think what you're enjoying is the stories of me doing bad things to my brother.
Well, I want to ask you two more questions. We want to reserve some time to pray for you and just let you know how much we appreciate you. But the first question would be, as you think about your career, particularly outside your experience outside the church in your work, where have you been? Where have you been tested to compromise your faith, and how have you dealt with that? Have you been asked to compromise your faith in order to make something happen?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you asked that question. Um, Back in the '90s, I was working for Cornell University, and my director was faking some numbers on the number of participants. Okay, and I had known this for a few years, but I didn't say anything. Okay, and I realized that was a compromise in my faith to just, sometimes being quiet is the same as lying about stuff. But then uh, he got caught in lying about some of the numbers, and he came to me to say, I need you to, without going into depth, he needed me to say that as far as I knew, the numbers were correct.
He wanted you to corroborate his side of the story.
Correct. And he did it in a very, very subtle way to make it look like I wouldn't know that he was doing it. We both knew that he was lying, but he did it in a very subtle way to make me think that he wouldn't know that I knew. I well, long story short, is I thought about it and I thought about it, and I'm like, no, I cannot do this. And I went to my dean at the time, and I said, this is not true. And they're like, well, we're going to need you to confront him in front of university attorneys on this. That was the toughest thing I have ever done. I remember I was shaking uh, driving to work that day. But this is funny, but you know what helped me with this? Certainly praying helped it, but I played the theme song to the original Star Trek movie. Ben understands. I was like, I still have that cassette tape, even though I have nothing to play it on. But that really helped, and that was, to this day, I think that's one of the toughest things I've ever done, was to confront my boss.
And of course, he was a tenured professor, right?
Correct.
And so that may have impacted whether or not you could get tenure as well.
Well, it was one of those things. I did get tenure at Cornell.
Oh yeah, it was in Texas.
It was in Texas. I didn't get it. So.
Well, I have one more question, and it's unrelated to sincerity of faith, but maybe testing how true your story is. I understand you had a romantic encounter with Tanya Tucker. Tanya Tucker is a really well-known country western music star. Tanya Tucker. What about that story?
Well, some of you all have heard this before, but I'll tell it again. Tanya Tucker was 14 years old. I was 11. Okay. So that meant I was a trophy boyfriend. Or potentially. No, seriously, I was a Boy Scout, and our community service project each year was to usher people in the rodeo stand in my hometown. And the Santa Rosa Rodeo is one of the biggest rodeos in the country. It's a qualifier for the National Finals Rodeo, so it's a big deal. Well, we're in our Boy Scout uniforms, and we're up there taking people to give us their ticket, and we take them to their seat. Well, it came it comes basically halftime, and they bring Tanya Tucker out, and she had just become famous, and it was really muddy in the rodeo arena, and her hat blew off, and she didn't want to jump off the stage to go get her hat. So she's like, "Can one of you Boy Scouts come get my hat?" And 20 of us were over the fence, and we were running top speed. And my number one competitor was my twin brother, and we were neck to neck. And fortunately for me, his boot got stuck in the mud, and he came out of his boot, and he couldn't run anymore. And so I got to the stage first. And so I got up on stage, and I got her hat, and I'm like, "Here you go, Ms. Tucker." Okay, because to me, when you're 11 and she's 14, that's like an old lady. You know? So I give her the hat, and she's like, "Well, thank you. Can I give you a kiss?" And lucky for me, I'm like, a Boy Scout cannot accept a gift for a good deed. I was more than willing to accept the gift. And anyway, so she's like, "Well, would you like to give me a kiss?" And I'm like, "Sure." And so I kissed her on the cheek. Okay.
Did you ever see her again after that kiss?
Well, she signed my Boy Scout belt with her autograph. And every year I retrace over it. And believe it or not, my wife helps me with it because she says she's proud to have a husband who kissed such a famous woman.
But she moved on from you, Sandy Tucker moved on from you.
Yeah, she went on to Glenn Campbell, which was not a good choice. So,
He must have been a better kisser, I guess.
I don't know.
That's ridiculous. Yeah, Tanya Tucker, you guys are not old enough to know, but she would have been like the winner of The Voice or something like that in her day. She was 13 or so when she hit the big time.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting.
It's funny. Last year we had our high school reunion, and I went to the museum in my hometown, and they still have the program with her picture on it. And there's a little sign in there that says Steve Brown kissed her.
That's fantastic.
Mhm.
Well, Steve, what I think I can speak for all of us, what we want you to know is how grateful we are to have you on this team. You're such a great addition to our family and a benefit to these students. And is there a way that we can gather around and pray for you? Is there a way we can pray for you today?
Well, I certainly would ask you to pray for me and my wife, but I specifically would ask you to pray for the situation at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and actually for all of the secular universities. It's it's a darkening world, and it's so great to be at ABC where it is not a darkening world. The situations at most public universities is it's increasingly the worst thing you could be as a Christian. And I uh, see that there's coming a time when being a Christian at a public university uh, would be the equivalent to being a member of the KKK. I mean, that's really where it is going right now. There are many, many people. Um, you know what? I do have a specific request. I would pray, or I would ask that you pray for the director of the Matanuska Experiment Farm. I used to take my classes from ABC out there for field trips and exercises. And a few years ago, I drove the ABC van with the logo on the side of it, and the director saw that, and she went nuts. And we were no longer allowed to take ABC students out there. And here, just even a few months ago, I'm almost certain she was trolling me here at ABC because she found a quote that I couldn't even hardly find on the ABC website that said most of our lab exercises will take place at the Matanuska Experiment Farm. So I was contacted by the vice provost to say, well, on your conflict of interest disclosure, you didn't say that you were being paid to be a professor at ABC. And I said, I'm not being paid to be a professor at ABC. I'm a volunteer. They could not believe that I would volunteer to teach here. And so, well, basically, I had to sign a statement that I was receiving no financial remuneration from the college. And, well, to make a long story short, the director at the experiment farm has tried to stop or get rid of me every way possible because of my involvement with ABC, and that stems to the fact that I'm a professing Christian. So I would ask that you all pray for her, because that's a very hard heart. But if you think about it, she's probably no different than Paul was.
But maybe an opportunity for you in your relationship with her that it'd be fun to see God use you in some way that right now seems impossible. Why don't we all just gather around Dr. Brown? That sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. Gather around him. You just grab the seat of honor there, brother.